Hi guys, it's Mrs. Lacefield here again, and today I'm going to read to you chapter 4 in the book Hatchet by Gary Paulsen. So, the last chapter, Brian took the plane down. It ran out of gas and he crashed it into a lake. Um, After he crashed into the lake, he was able to get out of the airplane and make it to land, and then he basically just passed out. So, we're going to find out what happens when he wakes back up. Okay? So, chapter 4. The memory was like a knife cutting into him, slicing deep into him with hate. The secret. He'd been riding his 10-speed with a friend named Terry. They'd been taking a run on a bike trail and decided to come back a different way, a way that took them past the Amber Mall. Brian remembered everything in incredible detail. Remember the time on the bank clock at the mall, flashing 3:31, then the temperature 82 and the date. All the numbers were part of the memory. All of his life was part of the memory. Terry just turned to smile at him about something, and Brian looked over Terry's head and saw her. His mother. She was sitting in a station wagon, a strange wagon. He saw her, and she did not see him. Brian was going to wave or call out, but something stopped him. There was a man in the car. Short blonde hair, the man had, wearing some kind of white pullover tennis shirt. Brian saw this and more, saw the secret, and saw more later, but the memory came in pieces. Came like scenes like this. Terry smiling, Brian looking over his head to see the station wagon's mother sitting with the man, the time and temperature clock, the front wheel of his bike, short blonde hair of the man, the white shirt of the man, and the hot hate slices of the memory were exact. The secret. Brian opened his eyes and screamed. For seconds he didn't know where he was, only that the crash was still happening. He was gonna die, and he screamed until his breath was gone. Then silence, filled with sobs as he pulled in air, half crying. How could it be so quiet? Moments ago there was nothing but noise, crashing and tearing, screaming. Now, quiet. Some birds were singing. How could birds be singing? His legs felt wet, and he raised up his hands and looked back down at them. They were in the lake. Strange. They went down to the water. He tried to move, but the pain hammered into him, made his breath shorten in gasps, and he stopped, his legs still in the water. Pain. Memory. He turned again. The sun came across the water, late sun, cut into his eyes and made him turn away. It was over then. The crash. He was alive. The crash is over and I'm alive, he thought. Then his eyes closed and he lowered his head for minutes that seemed longer. When he opened them again, it was evening, and some of the sharp pain had abated. There were many dull aches, and the crash came back to him fully. Into the trees and out onto the lake. The plane had crashed and sunk in the lake, and he had somehow pulled free. He raised himself and crawled out of the water, grunting with pain of movement. His legs were on fire, and his forehead felt as if someone had been pounding on with a hammer. But he could move. He pulled his legs out of the lake and crawled on his hands and knees until he was away from the wet, soft shore, and near a small stand of brush of some kind. Then he went down, only this time to rest, to save something of himself. He lay on his side and put his head on his arm and closed his eyes, because that was all he could do now, all he could think of being able to do. He closed his eyes and slept, dreamless, deep, and down. There was almost no light when he opened his eyes again. The darkness of night was thick, and for a moment he began to panic again. To see, he thought, to see is everything, but he could not see. But he turned his head without moving his body and saw across the lake. The sky was a light gray, that the sun was starting to come up, and he remembered that it had been evening when he went to sleep. Must be morning now. He mumbled it, almost in a hoarse whisper. As the thickness of sleep left him, the world came back. He was still in pain, all over pain. His legs were cramped and drawn up, tight and aching, and his back hurt when he tried to move. Worst was a keening throb in his head that pulsed with every beat of his heart. It seemed that the whole crash had happened to his head. He rolled on his back and felt his sides and his legs, moving things slowly. He rubbed his arms. Nothing seemed to be shattered, or even sprained all that badly. When he was 9, he'd plowed his small dirt bike into a parked car and broken his ankle, and had to wear a cast for 8 weeks. And there was nothing like that now. Nothing broken, just battered around a bit. His forehead felt massively swollen to the touch, almost like a mound over his eyes, and it was so tender that when his fingers grazed it, he nearly cried. But there was nothing he could do about it, and like the rest of him, it seemed to be more bruised than broken. I'm alive, he thought. I'm alive. It could have been different. There could have been death. I could have been done. Like the pilot, he thought suddenly. The pilot in the plane, down in the water, down into the blue water, strapped into the seat. He sat up, or at least tried to. First time he fell back. On the second attempt, grunting with the effort, he managed to come into a sitting position and scrunched sideways until his back was against a small tree, where he sat facing the lake, watching the sky get lighter and lighter with the coming dawn. His clothes were wet and clammy, and there was a faint chill. He pulled the torn remnants of his windbreaker, pieces really, around his shoulders, and tried to hold what his body could find. Could not think, could not make thought patterns work right. Things seemed to go back and forth between reality and imagination, except that it was all reality. One second he seemed only to have imagined there was a plane crash, that he had fought out of the sinking plane and swum to shore, that it all happened to some other person or in a movie playing in his mind. Then he would feel his clothes wet and cold, and his forehead would slash a pain through his thoughts, and he would know it was real, that it really happened. But all in a haze world. So he sat and stared at the lake, felt the pain come and go in waves, and watched the sun come over the end of the lake. So there's a picture. As you can see, it's a mosquito. You'll see why there's that picture in a second. It took an hour, perhaps two. He could not measure time yet, and he didn't care, for the sun to get halfway up. With it came some warmth. Small bits of it at first, and with the heat came clouds of insects. Thick, swarming hordes of mosquitoes that flocked to his body and made a living coat on his exposed skin, clogged his nostrils when he inhaled, poured into his mouth when he opened it to take a breath. It was not possibly believable. Not this. He'd come through the crash, but the insects were not possible. He coughed them up, spat them out, sneezed them out, closed his eyes and kept brushing his face, slapping and crushing them by the dozens, by the hundreds. But as soon as he cleared a place, as soon as he killed them, more came, thick, whining, buzzing masses of them. Mosquitoes and some small black flies he'd never seen before, all biting, chewing, and taking from him. In moments his eyes were swollen shut and his face puffy and round to match his battered forehead. He pulled the torn piece of his windbreaker over his head and tried to shelter in it, but the jacket was full of rips and it didn't work. In desperation, he pulled his t-shirt up to cover his face, but that exposed the skin of his lower back, and the mosquitoes and flies attacked the new, soft flesh of his back so viciously they pulled the shirt down. In the end, he sat with the windbreaker pulled up, brushing with his hands, and took it, almost crying in frustration and agony. There was nothing left to do, and when the sun was fully up and heating him directly, bringing steam off of his wet clothes and bathing him with warmth, the mosquitoes and flies disappeared. Almost that suddenly. One minute he was sitting in the middle of a swarm, the next they were gone, and the sun was on him. Vampires, he thought. Apparently they didn't like the deep of night, perhaps it was too cool, and they couldn't take the direct sunlight, but in that gray time in the morning, when it began to get warm before the sun was fully up and hot, he couldn't believe them. Never in all the reading and the movies he'd watched on television about the outdoors, never once had they mentioned the mosquitoes or the flies. All they ever showed in naturalist shows was beautiful scenery or animals jumping around having a good time. Nobody ever mentioned mosquitoes and flies. Ugh. He pulled himself up to stand against a tree and stretched, bringing new aches and pains. His back muscles must have been hurt as well. They almost seemed to tear when he stretched, and while the pain in his forehead seemed to be abating somewhat, just trying to stand made him weak enough to nearly collapse. The backs of his hands were puffy, and his eyes were almost swollen shut from the mosquitoes, and he saw everything through a narrow squint. Not there was much to see, he thought, scratching the bites. In front of him lay the lake, blue and deep. He had a sudden picture of the plane sunk in the lake, down and down in the blue with the pilot's body still strapped in the seat, his hair waving. He shook his head. More pain. That wasn't something to think about. He looked at his surroundings again. The lake stretched out slightly below him. He was at the base of the L, looking up the long part with the short part out to his right. In the morning light and calm, the water was absolutely, perfectly still. He could see the reflections of the trees on the other side of the lake. Upside down in the water, they seemed almost like another forest, an upside-down forest to match the real one. As he watched, a large bird, he thought it looked like a crow, but it seemed larger, flew from the top, real forest, and the reflection bird matched it, both flying out over the water. Everything was green, so green that it went into him. The forest was largely made up of pines and spruce, with stands of some low brush smeared here and there, and thick grass and some other kind of small brush all over. He couldn't identify most of it, except the evergreens, and some leafy trees he thought might be aspen. He'd seen pictures of aspens in the mountains on television. The country around the lake was moderately hilly, but the hills were small, almost hummocks, and there were very few rocks except to his left. There lay a rocky ridge that stuck out overlooking the lake about 20 feet high. If the plane had come down a little to the left, it would have hit the rocks and never made the lake. He would have smashed. Destroyed. The word came. I would have been destroyed and torn and smashed, driven to the rocks and destroyed. Luck, he thought. I have luck. I have good luck there. But he knew that was wrong. If he'd had good luck, his parents wouldn't have divorced because of the secret. He wouldn't have been flying with a pilot who'd had a heart attack. And he wouldn't be here where he had to have good luck. Good luck to keep from being destroyed. If you keep walking back from good luck, he thought, you'll come to bad luck. He shook his head again, wincing. Another thing not to think about. The rocky ridge was rounded and seemed to be of some kind of sandstone, with bits of darker stone layered and stuck into it. Directly across the lake from it, at the inside corner of the L, was a mound of sticks and mud rising up out of the water a good 8 or 10 feet. At first, Brian couldn't place it, but knew that he somehow knew what it was. He'd seen it in films. There's the crow that flew across the lake. He had seen it in films. Then a small brown head popped to the surface of the water near the mound and began swimming off down the short leg of the L, leaving a V of ripples behind. And he remembered where he'd seen it. It was a beaver house, called a beaver lodge, and especially he'd seen it on a public channel. A fish jumped, not a large fish, but made a big splash near the beaver, and as if by a signal there were suddenly little splops all over the sides of the lake, along the shore, as the fish began jumping. Hundreds of them, jumping and slapping the water. Brian watched them for a time, still in a half daze, still not thinking well. The scenery was very pretty, he thought, and there were new things to look at, but it was all a green and blue blur, and he was used to the gray and the black of the city, the sounds of the city. Traffic, people talking, sounds all the time, the hum and whine of the city. Here at first it was silent, or he thought it was silent, but when he started to listen, really listen, he heard thousands of things. Hisses and blurks, small sounds, birds singing, the hum of insects, splashes of the fish jumping. There was a great noise here, but a noise he didn't know, and the colors were new to him, and the colors and the noise mixed in his mind to make a green-blue blur that he could hear. Here, with a hissing pulse sound, he was still tired. So tired. So awfully tired, and standing had taken a lot of energy somehow. It had drained him. He supposed he was still in some sort of shock from the crash, and there was still the pain, the dizziness, the strange feeling. He found another tree, a tall pine with no branches until the top, and sat with his back against it, looking down at the lake, with the sun warming him, and in a few moments he scrunched down and was asleep again. There's the picture, right there, of the beaver. Okay, so that was chapter 4. Next, we'll find out what happens when Brian wakes back up. Probably seems pretty overwhelming, right? I don't know what I would do in that situation, but we'll find out what he does next time. Talk to you later.